Picture this. It's the late 1980s. A single income covers the basics. One job, one commute, one paycheck that somehow stretches far enough to handle rent, groceries, a car payment, and a family vacation that doesn't require a spreadsheet. The house isn't glamorous. The car isn't new. But the math works. Stability isn't aspirational. It's assumed. Now fast forward. It's not that Americans stopped working. They work more hours than ever. They're more educated than ever. They're more productive than ever. And yet they feel poorer, tighter, constantly one unexpected expense away from panic. Not broke, just permanently fragile. That feeling isn't psychological. It's mathematical. Now wake up. It's September 2026. The American middle class didn't collapse in a dramatic crash. There was no single year where everything snapped. No headline that said, it's over. Instead, it happened the way systems actually fail, quietly, incrementally, through incentives that stacked in the same direction for decades. This isn't a story about laziness. It isn't about bad budgeting. And it isn't about people making the wrong choices. It's about a structure that slowly stopped working, while pretending it still was. Tonight, we're going to walk through how the American middle class was slowly repriced out of existence step by step. Not with vibes, not with nostalgia, with mechanisms. Number 1, the wage freeze. When paychecks stopped meaning what they used to meet Mark. Mark isn't irresponsible. He doesn't live extravagantly. He has a stable job, a degree, and what older generations would still call a good career. His income rises occasionally. Promotions happen. On paper, he's doing fine. But something strange keeps happening. Every raise feels like it evaporates. Every year costs more than the last. And no matter how disciplined he is, the gap never closes. This is where the collapse actually begins. For most of the post-war period, wages and productivity moved together. When workers produced more value, they were paid more. That relationship wasn't perfect, but it existed. The middle class grew because paychecks grew alongside the economy. Then, quietly, the link snapped. Productivity kept rising. Corporate profits expanded. Asset prices climbed. But wages flattened out, especially after inflation. Not collapsed, flattened. That distinction matters because flat wages don't feel like a crisis. They feel survivable, until they aren't. The mechanism is simple and brutal. When wages stop rising in real terms, every essential cost increase becomes permanent damage. Housing goes up? That's not a temporary squeeze. Healthcare premiums rise? That's locked in. Education costs jump? That compounds across generations. Nothing resets. The middle class doesn't disappear because income falls. It disappears because costs move faster than pay year after year, until what used to be comfortable becomes tight, and what used to be tight becomes impossible. And here's the part people misunderstand. This didn't require conspiracy. It required incentives. Globalization rewarded capital flexibility. Automation rewarded ownership. Policy favored growth metrics, not household resilience. The system did exactly what it was optimized to do. The result? A paycheck that still looks respectable, but no longer functions the way it used to. And while most people were told to just negotiate harder or learn new skills, another pressure was quietly locking in place. Because even if your income stagnates, your fixed costs don't. And the biggest fixed cost of all was about to change permanently. Number 2, the cost lock-in. When essentials became non-negotiable, meet Sarah. Sarah budgets. She tracks expenses. She isn't reckless. But every month, her financial life feels less flexible. There's less room to adjust, less margin, less ability to absorb shocks. That's because modern middle-class life is built on cost lock-ins. Housing, healthcare, insurance, education, transportation, these aren't optional expenses. You can downgrade slightly, but you can't opt out. And once these costs rise, they rarely come back down. This is the part economists love to smooth over. Inflation doesn't hit evenly. Some prices rise and fall. Others only move in one direction. The middle class depends disproportionately on the second category. Rent increases don't reverse. Insurance premiums don't deflate. Healthcare costs don't normalize. Education debt doesn't get cheaper with time. Each cost locks in at a higher level, shrinking flexibility permanently. The system quietly shifts from variable to rigid. In the past, middle-class households could rebalance, cut discretionary spending, delay a purchase, work a little more. Today, most of the budget is pre-committed before the month even begins. That's why people feel stuck even when they're employed. Not trapped by debt necessarily, but trapped by obligations that compound faster than income. And this creates a dangerous illusion. On paper, nothing looks catastrophic. People are still employed. Credit is still flowing. Consumption continues. But under the surface, resilience disappears. There's no buffer. So when something does go wrong, a medical issue, a job transition, a rent hike, an insurance repricing, The system doesn't bend, it breaks households instead. And while families were adjusting to this new rigidity, another shift was happening quietly in the background, one that changed the rules of stability entirely, because stability itself was being converted into something you had to buy. For 3, the asset wall. When stability turned into a pay-to-enter system. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. For decades, the American middle class didn't just rely on income, it relied on assets, especially housing, to do the heavy lifting. Homeownership wasn't just shelter, it was forced savings, it was inflation protection. It was leverage that worked for households instead of against them, but access to that system changed. As asset prices rose faster than wages, entry moved further out of reach. Not suddenly, gradually. Down payments became harder. Credit standards tightened, monthly payments ballooned, insurance and taxes piled on. What used to be a step in adulthood became a gate. If you crossed it early, you benefited. If you arrived late, the cost exploded. If you never arrived, you stayed exposed forever. This is where the collapse becomes generational. The middle class didn't just lose income growth, it lost asset access at scale. And without assets, households became permanently dependent on wages that were already lagging. The system flipped. Ownership became optional for institutions and conditional for families. That didn't feel like a collapse either. It felt like bad timing, like personal failure, like maybe next year. But structurally, something had changed. The ladder was still there. It just moved faster than most people could climb. And once that happened, the middle class stopped being a stable category. It became a temporary condition. Nothing is broken yet. No crash, no reset, no moment of clarity, just pressure. And in part 2, we're going to look at why the safety nets people assumed would catch them didn't, and how debt, credentials, and good jobs stopped functioning as protection. By the time most people realized something was wrong, they were already doing everything they were told would keep them safe. They went to school. They took on debt responsibly. They chased stable careers. They delayed gratification. And still, the ground kept shifting. This is the phase of the collapse that hurts the most, because this is where the promised protections quietly failed. 4. The credential trap. When doing everything right stopped working. Meet Daniel. Daniel followed the playbook. He went to college because he was told education was insulation. A degree wasn't a luxury, it was armor. The more specialized, the better. So he stacked credentials, certifications, graduate school, professional licenses, and for a while, it worked, until it didn't. The middle class once relied on a simple exchange. Skills, income, stability. But over time, credentials stopped being differentiators and started becoming minimum entry tickets. Degrees didn't guarantee upward mobility anymore. They just prevented immediate downward mobility. The mechanism here is subtle but devastating. As more people were pushed into higher education, credentials inflated. Jobs that once required experience now required degrees. Jobs that once required degrees now required graduate degrees. The signal lost its power. At the same time, the cost of acquiring those credentials exploded. So households didn't just invest in education, they leveraged into it. Debt replaced risk sharing. Instead of employers training workers, workers prepaid the system with loans, betting their future income on labor markets they didn't control. And when those markets shifted, the debt didn't. Education stopped functioning as protection and started functioning as a fixed cost. The result? A workforce that is more educated than ever, but also more financially fragile than ever. And once credentials stopped insulating households, the next supposed shield stepped in. Debt. Number 5. The debt normalization. When borrowing became the substitute for income, meet Alyssa. Alyssa doesn't feel reckless. She feels modern. She uses credit cards, auto loans, payment plans, and monthly financing the same way people used savings decades ago. Not to splurge, but to smooth life. This is where the system made its most dangerous pivot. When wages stopped keeping up, debt quietly took their place. At first, borrowing was framed as flexibility, then as opportunity, then as necessity, and eventually as background noise. Student loans replaced affordable education. Auto loans replaced reliable public transit. Credit cards replaced emergency savings. Buy now, pay later replaced disposable income. The economy didn't slow down because debt kept demand alive, but households didn't get richer. They got more leveraged. And leverage always feels manageable until conditions change. Interest rates rise. Jobs become less secure. Insurance costs spike. A medical bill lands at the wrong time. Debt doesn't care why you're struggling. This is why the modern middle class feels constantly behind, even when income looks fine. A growing share of monthly cash flow isn't buying a better life. It is servicing yesterday as survival decisions. The old system assumed debt was temporary. The new system assumes debt is permanent. And when debt becomes permanent, stability becomes conditional. But surely, people thought, good jobs would still protect them. That was the last illusion to fall. Number 6. The job. Illusion. Why employment? No longer equals security. Meet Kevin. Kevin is employed. His company is profitable. His title sounds respectable. From the outside, he looks safe. Inside, he knows better. His role depends on quarterly targets. His benefits shift every year. His workload expands without matching compensation. And layoffs happen in waves, quietly, strategically, with better language, but the same outcome. The middle class once relied on jobs that traded loyalty for security. Long-term employment wasn't guaranteed, but it was common enough to plan around. That contract dissolved without ceremony. Jobs became flexible for companies, not for workers. At the same time, risk was offloaded downward. Healthcare tied to employment, retirement tied to market performance, training tied to personal expense. Career risk individualized. The economy became more dynamic. Households became more exposed. And here's the dangerous misunderstanding. Low unemployment does not mean high security. It means people are working. It says nothing about volatility, benefits, predictability, or resilience. A system can be fully employed and deeply unstable at the same time. That's exactly where we are. So when people look around and ask, why does everything feel harder even though the economy is technically fine? This is the answer. The protections were removed quietly, the risks were redistributed downward, and responsibility was reframed as personal failure. By this point in the story, the middle class isn't collapsing because people stopped trying. It's collapsing because every layer that once absorbed shocks has been stripped away. And when that happens, pressure doesn't disappear, it moves. In part 3, we're going to look at what this does to behavior, to families, to long-term planning, and why this slow collapse is now reshaping how an entire generation thinks about the future itself. By the time the structure fully reveals itself, most people are already exhausted. Not dramatic exhaustion, not collapse in the street exhaustion, a quieter kind, the kind where you stop planning far ahead, where you delay decisions not because you're lazy, but because every option feels fragile, where the future starts to feel conditional. This is the final stage of the collapse, not financial, psychological. Number 7, the waiting room economy. When life goes on, pause, meet Emily and Josh. They aren't struggling in the traditional sense. They're employed. They pay their bills. They don't feel desperate. But they're always waiting. Waiting to buy a home. Waiting to feel secure enough to have a child. Waiting for interest rates to fall. Waiting for prices to stabilize. Waiting for after this phase. This is what the slow collapse produces. Not poverty, suspension. When stability becomes expensive and unpredictable, people delay life milestones. Marriage happens later. Children happen later or not at all. Career risks are avoided. Geographic moves feel dangerous instead of liberating. Economists don't model this well. They measure consumption, employment, and GDP. They don't measure hesitation. They don't measure the cost of living in a permanent holding pattern. But you can see it everywhere. People aren't failing forward. They're rotting in place. And this isn't because they lack ambition. It's because delayed gratification no longer guarantees a payoff. In the old system, patience was rewarded. In the new one, patience is often punished. So people adapt. Mario 8. Doom spending, doom working, and the end of long-term trust. This is where critics get it wrong. They look at younger generations and say, if you stopped spending on small pleasures, you'd be fine. But the math doesn't support that story. When essential costs rise faster than income, saving feels irrational. Not because people don't understand discipline, but because the target keeps moving, so behavior changes. People spend on experiences because assets feel unreachable. They job hop because loyalty no longer pays. They optimize for now because later feels unreliable. This isn't recklessness, it's adaptation. When systems stop rewarding long-term planning, humans stop planning long-term. Trust erodes, not just in markets, but in institutions, employers, and the idea that effort maps cleanly to outcomes. This is the hidden damage of the middle-class collapse. Not just lower wealth, but lower belief. When belief disappears, engagement follows. People disengage from politics, from institutions, from the future. They stop imagining upside and focus on survival plus moments of relief. And that SS, when the collapse stops being about money and starts being about the social contract itself. Number 9, final synthesis. What actually happened and what comes next? So let's answer the title directly. The American middle class didn't collapse because people failed. It collapsed because the system quietly changed its rules. Wages stopped tracking productivity. Essential costs locked in permanently. Assets became pay to enter. Debt replaced income growth. Jobs shed security. And risk was pushed downward while responsibility was individualized. None of this happened overnight. That's why nobody noticed. It didn't feel like collapse. It felt like personal stress. Now, where does that leave us? There are 3 realistic paths forward. Base case. The slow grind continues. Costs remain elevated. Wages lag. Ownership becomes less common, multi-generational living normalizes, the middle class exists, but thinner, older, and more fragile. Better case, policy shifts realign incentives, housing supply expands, healthcare and education costs slow, asset access broadens. This doesn't restore the old dream, but it stabilizes the floor. Worst case, costs reaccelerate. Insurance, housing, and debt stress intensify. More households become one shock away from failure. Stability becomes a premium product. What should people watch? Not headlines, mechanisms. Watch whether wages outpace essential costs. Watch access to ownership, not asset prices alone. Watch debt service ratios, not just employment numbers. Watch whether risk is being shared or dumped downward again. Adaptation, not surrender. Here's the part that matters most. Understanding this system isn't about despair. It's about clarity. You're not lazy. You're not irresponsible. You didn't miss something obvious. You're navigating the most hostile middle-class environment in modern American history, one that rewards flexibility, punishes rigidity, and quietly shifted the goalposts without telling anyone. The American dream isn't gone, but it's no longer standardized. Adaptation might mean shared ownership. It might mean geographic flexibility. It might mean redefining success away from old milestones that no longer reflect reality. None of that is failure. The real failure would be internalizing a systemic breakdown as a personal one. One last thing. If this breakdown resonated with you, tell me which part hit hardest. The wage freeze, the debt trap, or the psychological toll. Subscribe to The Quiet Market if you want calm, honest explanations of how these systems actually work, without hype and without blaming individuals for structural failures. And if you want to see how the same logic plays out even more aggressively, watch our next breakdown on how housing and assets reshaped entire national economies. Thanks for watching. And genuinely, good luck out there.